In the fading light of a Montana evening, a young woman's quiet sobs echo through an old barn's rafters. She's come so far, across an ocean, then half a continent, only to find no one waiting at the station. Her promised family never arrived. With nowhere else to go, she sought shelter in this weathered building, her few possessions clutched close, her dreams of a new life crumbling like the dried hay beneath her. As dawn approaches, a lone cowboy riding past on his morning rounds hears something that makes him pause. What he discovers in that barn will change both their lives forever. But what made this struggling rancher, a man who could barely feed himself, decide to offer marriage to a complete stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last whistle of the steam engine faded into the Montana dusk, leaving Sarah O'Brien alone on the wooden platform of Silver Creek Station. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the letter in her pocket, the one promising a new life, a fresh start with the Henderson family of Silver Creek, the same family whose absence now hung heavy in the cooling evening air. She adjusted her carpet bag, its worn handles soft from years of use. Inside lay her entire world, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. The image, though faded, showed her mother's gentle smile, the same smile Sarah had inherited, along with her father's determined green eyes. "Excuse me?" she called out to the station master, who was preparing to lock up for the night. "The Henderson family, are you certain they received no word about my arrival?" The old man's weathered face softened with pity. "Nothing, miss. Been quiet all day, save for the usual freight delivery." He hesitated, then added, "Town's got a boarding house just down the street. Mrs. Miller's a fair sort." "Thank you," Sarah cut him off, pride stiffening her spine. The truth was, her remaining funds wouldn't cover even a single night's stay. The journey from Ireland had depleted nearly everything, with just enough set aside for emergencies. This, she supposed, qualified as such, though not in the way she'd imagined. She walked down the town's main street, past the general store with its shuttered windows, and the saloon where raucous laughter spilled into the growing darkness. Every step took her further from the life she'd imagined, from the respectable position as governess to the Henderson children that had been promised in their correspondence. The spring evening carried a bite of lingering winter, and Sarah pulled her worn shawl tighter. On the outskirts of town, a large barn stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its doors hung slightly ajar, offering a glimpse of hay-filled shadows within. Something about its quiet solidity drew her forward. Sarah slipped inside, the sweet scent of hay and horse enveloping her. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, creating patterns on the dirt floor. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her carpetbag bumping against each rung. The hay was fresh, and in one corner a horse blanket lay forgotten. As she arranged the blanket over the hay, Sarah's fingers brushed against her mother's Bible in the carpetbag. She pulled it out, its familiar weight anchoring her to memories of home, of Sunday mornings in their small cottage, the smell of fresh bread, and her mother's voice reading passages by candlelight. "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you, Mama?" she whispered, opening the Bible to where a pressed shamrock marked her favorite psalm. Her mother had always said God had a purpose for every trial, though Sarah struggled to see it now. The first. Tears came quietly, born more of exhaustion than despair. She'd shed enough tears on the journey across the Atlantic, watching Ireland fade into the mist. These were different. Tears of uncertainty, of paths not taken and promises broken. As she curled up on the makeshift bed, Sarah thought of the letter she'd received 3 months ago. Mrs. Henderson's elegant handwriting had painted such a lovely picture. 3 children needing education, a position of respect in a growing frontier, a town, the chance to build a new life far from the memories of famine and loss that still haunted Ireland. Just until morning, she murmured to herself, pulling the horse blanket closer. Tomorrow I'll figure something out. The words felt hollow in the vast space of the barn, but they were all she had. That, and the strange peace that seemed to emanate from the sturdy walls around her. Outside, a lone owl called into the night. The sound reminded her of home, of the birds that used to nest in the old oak behind their cottage. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the familiar sound soothe her. As sleep began to creep in, she held on to one thought. She hadn't come all this way to give up now. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new paths forward. For now, though, she could rest, protected by the solid beams above and the soft hay beneath. The moon continued its arc across the sky, casting shifting shadows through the barn's slats. In her sleep, Sarah's fingers remained curled around her mother's Bible, its pages holding not just prayers, but pressed flowers from home, letters from her sister in Dublin, and the last tangible connections to the life she'd left behind. As dawn approached, bringing with it footsteps that would change her fate, she slept the deep sleep of one who had reached the end of one journey, unknowingly poised at the beginning of another. Thomas Barrett rose before the sun, as he had every day for the past 15 years. The ranch house creaked around him, empty sounds in empty rooms. He lit the oil lamp, its warm glow catching the leather-bound ledger on his desk. Last night's figures still stared up at him, each column telling the same story. The ranch was failing. He pulled on his boots, worn smooth at the heels, and took his father's old pocket watch from its place beside his bed. The gold was tarnished now, but the mechanism still kept perfect time. 5 minutes to 4, early enough to check the far pasture before the day's heat set in. In the kitchen, he stirred the banked coals in the stove and set coffee to boil. While he waited, Thomas reviewed the ledger one more time. The drought had hit everyone hard, but being alone made it worse. No hands to help with the cattle, no one to tend the vegetable garden his mother had once kept so carefully. Just him, trying to hold onto a dream that seemed to be slipping through his fingers like the dry Montana soil. The coffee was bitter and strong, just as his father had taught him to make it. Outside, the pre-dawn air carried the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. His horse, Duke, nickered softly as Thomas approached the small stable attached to the house. "Morning, old friend," Thomas murmured, running a hand along Duke's neck. The horse was getting on in years, just like everything else on the Barrett ranch. But like Thomas himself, Duke wasn't ready to give up just yet. As he saddled Duke, Thomas's mind wandered to yesterday's letter from the bank. Third notice this month. The words seemed burned into his memory. Payment past due, foreclosure. Proceedings, immediate attention required. His father would have known how to handle this. James Barrett had built this ranch from nothing, turning a patch of Montana wilderness into a respectable cattle operation. But that was before the drought, before the cattle prices dropped, before Thomas found himself alone with a legacy he couldn't seem to preserve, no matter how hard he worked. Duke's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they rode out. The morning star still hung bright in the eastern sky, a silent witness to their daily routine. They checked the fence line first. Thomas had repaired it just last week, but the winter had been hard on the posts, and he couldn't afford to lose any more cattle to wandering. The far pasture lay quiet in the pre-dawn light. Too quiet. The grass was sparse, barely enough to sustain the reduced herd he had left. Thomas made a mental note to move them to the north section tomorrow, though that grass wasn't much better. He pulled out his father's watch again. Time to check the old barn by the town road. It wasn't much use now. Too far from the house to be practical, but his father had built it as a way station for the cattle drives of better days. Thomas kept it maintained, out of respect for the past, and sometimes used it to store extra hay when he could afford it. As Duke picked his way along the familiar trail, Thomas found his thoughts turning to his mother's last words to him. "The land provides, Thomas, but you have to be willing to see what it's offering." He hadn't understood then. The land seemed to be offering nothing but hardship lately. The first rays of sun were just breaking over the eastern hills when Thomas heard something unusual. Duke's ears pricked forward, and Thomas reined him to a stop. There it was again, a sound from the old barn. Probably just a stray cow, he thought. But in these hard times, he couldn't afford to assume anything. He dismounted quietly, his boots crunching softly on the packed earth. The barn door was slightly ajar, though he remembered closing it yesterday. Thomas paused, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, almost like a sob. Thomas felt his hand drift to the revolver at his hip, then fall away. Whatever was in that barn, it wasn't a threat. Not that kind, anyway. He took a deep breath of the cool morning air and stepped forward. The hinges creaked slightly as he pushed the door wider, letting in the first grey light of dawn. What he found there would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. Sometimes his mother's words came back to him in the strangest moments. The land provides. You just have to be willing to see what it's offering. The barn's shadows slowly retreated before the advancing dawn. Thomas stood in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Another soft sob drifted down from the hayloft, followed by a rustle of movement. "Hello?" he called softly, not wanting to frighten whoever was up there. "I'm the owner of this barn. Are you hurt?" There was a moment of silence, then a voice, feminine, touched with an Irish lilt, replied, "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to trespass. I'll leave straight away." Thomas heard shuffling above, and then a young woman appeared at the top of the ladder. Even in the dim light, he could see she was trying to maintain her dignity, though her eyes were red from crying. She wore a simple dark dress, dusty from travel, and clutched a carpet bag in one hand while attempting to climb down. "Careful there," Thomas said, moving forward as she struggled with the awkward descent. "Let me help with that bag." She hesitated, then handed it down to him. The bag was surprisingly light, as if it contained little more than hope and promises. When she reached the ground, she stood straight back despite her obvious exhaustion. "I'm Thomas Barrett," he said, setting her bag down carefully. "And you're not trespassing." "Not really. This barn's seen plenty of travelers over the years." "Sarah O'Brien?" She smoothed her skirts, a nervous gesture. "I was supposed to meet the Henderson family yesterday evening. They'd arranged for me to be their governess, but—" Her voice trailed off. Thomas frowned. "The Hendersons? They moved to Oregon 2 months ago. Their place was foreclosed." He saw the news hit her like a physical blow, though she struggled to hide it. His hand went to his pocket, where his mother's wedding ring still resided, the one piece of jewelry he hadn't sold during the worst of the drought. He'd carried it for years, waiting for something. "Do you have somewhere else to go?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah shook her head slightly, then lifted her chin. "I'll figure something out. Perhaps there's other work in town." "Town's not hiring much these days," Thomas interrupted gently. "Droughts hit everyone hard." He paused, thinking of the empty ranch house, the endless silent meals, the work that never seemed to end. Though she looked at him questioningly, and Thomas suddenly felt the weight of what he was about to propose. It was crazy, really, the kind of thing his father would have called reckless. But then James Barrett had always said, opportunity didn't announce itself with trumpets. It whispered from the shadows of ordinary days. "Miss O'Brien," he began, then started again. "Sarah, I have a ranch, about 2 miles from here. It's not much and times are hard, but—" He took a deep breath. "I could use a wife, someone to help work the land, keep the books, share the load." Her eyes widened, and he hurried on. "I know it's not what you came here for. I'm not offering romance or riches. Just a fair partnership, a chance for both of us to make something work." Sarah was silent for a long moment, studying him in the growing light. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I know you're brave enough to cross an ocean on a promise," Thomas replied. "I know you kept your dignity even when that promise fell through. And I know my ranch needs more than just my 2 hands to survive. He pulled out the ring, its gold catching the first real light of day. It was my mother's. She was Irish too, as it happens. Sarah looked at the ring, then at the lightening sky outside the barn doors. A partnership, she said slowly, testing the word, not a romance. Just 2 people helping each other make a life, Thomas agreed. Though I should warn you, the ranch is in trouble. Bank's been sending notices. It won't be easy. A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. Mr. Barrett, I left Ireland during the famine. I know about not easy. She held out her hand then, not for the ring, but to shake his. A partnership then. Though we should do this properly with a preacher and witnesses. Thomas felt something unlock in his chest. A door he hadn't realized was closed. Reverend Mills lives just up the road. He's usually up early to tend his chickens. He picked up her carpet bag. Shall we? Sarah nodded, and together they stepped out of the barn into the full dawn light. Later, Thomas would remember this moment, how the rising sun painted everything in shades of possibility, how Sarah's step matched his, as if they'd been walking together for years, how sometimes the biggest chances come disguised as simple choices, made in the quiet of morning. The morning mist still clung to the grass as Thomas and Sarah walked the dirt path to Reverend Mills's house. Duke followed behind, his reins loose in Thomas's hand, his hoofbeats marking a steady rhythm to their silence. Each step felt both momentous and ordinary. The paradox of life-changing decisions made in the quiet hours before the world fully wakes. Sarah clutched her mother's Bible close. She'd taken it from her carpet bag before Thomas secured the rest of her belongings to Duke's saddle. Its familiar weight anchored her as thoughts tumbled through her mind. The absurdity of marrying a stranger, the practical wisdom of the arrangement, the strange sense of rightness that she couldn't quite explain. Reverend Mills is a good man, Thomas said suddenly, breaking the contemplative quiet. Known him since I was a boy. He helped my family through some hard times after my mother passed. Sarah nodded, appreciating how he offered these small pieces of himself, building a bridge between strangers. My father was a minister, she shared in return, small parish in County Cork. He always said God works in practical ways, if we're wise enough to see them. Thomas glanced at her, a smile touching the corners of his eyes. Sounds like something my mother would have said. She had a way of finding providence in everyday things. They crested a small hill, and a modest white house came into view. Smoke already rose from its chimney, and in the yard, a tall man in a black coat scattered feed to a flock of chickens. He looked up at their approach, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Thomas Barrett, he called out, you're about the last person I'd expect to see at this hour, and with company, no less. Morning, Reverend, Thomas replied, removing his hat. We've come with an unusual request. The Reverend's eyes moved from Thomas to Sarah, then to the Bible she held. Understanding dawned in his expression. Perhaps you'd both better come inside. Martha's just put coffee on. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Mrs. Mills, a small woman with kind eyes, took one look at Sarah and disappeared, upstairs, returning moments later with a brush and a few pins. Can't have you getting married with hay in your hair, dear, she said matter-of-factly, leading Sarah to a corner of the kitchen, while Mrs. Mills gently worked the tangles from Sarah's dark hair. Reverend Mills sat at the kitchen table with Thomas, their heads bent over a piece of paper. Sarah caught fragments of their conversation, legal requirements, witness signatures, the necessity of publishing bans under normal circumstances. Though I suppose, the Reverend was saying, these aren't exactly normal circumstances. He looked up, catching Sarah's eye. My dear, are you quite certain about this? Marriage is not a decision to be made lightly. Sarah met his gaze steadily. No, sir, it's not. But sometimes the right decision doesn't need much time, only clarity. The Reverend nodded slowly, something like approval warming his expression. Martha, would you fetch the good quill, the one we use for baptismal certificates? Mrs. Mills finished pinning Sarah's hair, now neatly arranged despite its simplicity. "There," she said softly. "Every bride deserves at least this much fuss." Even at dawn, they gathered in the Reverend's small study. Morning light streamed through the east window, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Sarah stood beside Thomas, acutely aware of his quiet strength, the respectful distance he maintained even as they prepared to join their lives. The ceremony was brief, but dignified. Reverend Mills read from Sarah's Bible, the Irish Gaelic inscription, on its cover catching the light. Thomas's hands were steady as he slipped his mother's ring onto Sarah's finger. The gold was warm, as if it carried the memories of the woman who had worn it before. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Mills intoned. The words echoed in the small room, carrying the weight of generations. When it was done, Mrs. Mills insisted they stay for breakfast. Over coffee and fresh bread, they spoke of practical things, the ranch, the drought, the work ahead. But there were lighter moments too, like when Mrs. Mills told stories of Thomas as a boy, making him duck his head in embarrassment. As they prepared to leave, Reverend Mills pressed the marriage certificate into Sarah's hands. The ink was barely dry, the letters carefully formed. Thomas James Barrett and Sarah Margaret O'Brien, joined in holy matrimony on this day, witnessed before God and company. "Your father's ring suits her," Mrs. Mills said softly to Thomas as they stood in the doorway. "Catherine would have approved." Thomas nodded, words seemingly caught in his throat. Sarah pretended not to notice as she adjusted her shawl, giving him time to compose himself. Already she was learning to read him, to understand the quiet ways he carried his heart. They mounted Duke together, Sarah sitting sideways in front of Thomas, her carpet bag and Bible secure. As they rode toward their new life, the sun finally cleared the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and promise. The Barrett Ranch came into view as they crested the last hill, the morning sun catching on its weathered surfaces. A two-story farmhouse stood sentinel over the property, its white paint faded but intact, a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Behind it, a cluster of outbuildings spread across the yard, barn, stable, smokehouse, and what looked like a chicken coop fallen into disuse. Thomas felt Sarah straighten slightly in front of him, taking in her new home. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but the bones are good. My father built that house himself, raised every beam by hand." "It's more than I expected," Sarah replied, and he heard genuine appreciation in her voice. "Those roses by the porch, they're beautiful. My mother's climbing roses. About the only thing that thrives without much tending." He guided Duke through the gate, adding, "though they haven't been pruned properly in years." As they dismounted, Sarah's eyes swept across the property with what Thomas recognized as a practical assessment rather than mere curiosity. She noted the vegetable garden, now mostly bare earth, and the empty clothesline strung between two posts. "The well?" she asked, already thinking of daily needs. "Just there, behind the house. Water's sweet and hasn't failed yet, even in the worst drought years." He lifted her carpet bag from Duke's saddle. "Shall I show you inside?" The house was cool and dim after the morning brightness. Thomas led her through the front room, with its stone fireplace and his father's old armchair, into the kitchen. Here, signs of bachelor living were most evident. Dishes stacked haphazardly, coffee cups left on every surface, ledgers and papers scattered across the table. Sarah set her Bible down gently, then rolled up her sleeves. The gesture was so natural, so matter-of-fact, that Thomas felt something catch in his throat. How long had it been since someone besides himself had moved purposefully through these rooms? "The stove works well," he offered, "though it pulls to the left. You have to watch the heat on that side. And where do you keep your flour? Sugar?" She was already opening cupboards, creating a mental inventory. "Oh, and I saw a pump by the back door. Does it work, or do we need to haul from the well?" "Pump works fine in warm weather. Flowers in the barrel by the pantry." He watched as she nodded, filing away each piece of information. Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Upstairs, he showed her the bedrooms, his parents' old room, now thick with dust, and his own sparse chamber with its narrow bed and wooden chest. "You should take the main bedroom," he said quickly. "I'll stay in mine, or sleep downstairs if you prefer. There's a perfectly good cot in the study." Sarah's expression softened at his awkward gallantry. "Mr. Barrett, Thomas," she corrected herself. "We're married now. However unusual the circumstances, I don't expect you to sleep on a cot in your own home." He felt his ears redden. I want you to feel safe here, comfortable." "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "But comfort can mean many things, like knowing where one stands." She smoothed her skirt, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as a sign of gathering thoughts. "We agreed to a partnership. That means trust, doesn't it? And honesty?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his chest. "Then let's be honest. We're strangers who've made a practical arrangement, but we're also husband and wife before God and the law. I propose. We share the main bedroom, it's certainly large enough, and let time tell us what other arrangements might be needed." Her pragmatism, wrapped in dignity and grace, struck him speechless for a moment. Then he found himself smiling. "My mother would have liked you," he said simply. They spent the rest of the morning settling in. Sarah transformed the kitchen with swift efficiency, bringing order to chaos, while Thomas tended to the morning's ranch work. When he came in for dinner, lunch, she called it, he found fresh coffee brewing and the table cleared for a proper meal. "I found some salt pork and potatoes," she said, setting out plates. "Tomorrow I'll need to take a proper inventory, make lists of what's needed." "About that," Thomas said carefully, "funds are tight. The bank—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "I saw the notices in your ledger while I was clearing the table. We'll manage." She paused, then added, "I'm good with figures. Perhaps I could help with the books." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman he'd married in haste that morning, but a true partner beginning to emerge. "I'd like that," he said. "After dinner, I'll show you the whole operation. Every debt, every asset. No secrets between partners, right?" Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "No secrets," she agreed, and poured him a cup of coffee that somehow smelled better than any he'd made himself in years. Dawn found Sarah already awake, listening to Thomas dress quietly in the grey light. Their first night, as husband and wife, had passed with polite distance maintained between them. Thomas on one side of the big bed, Sarah on the other, a valley of quilts between them. Yet there was comfort in sharing space, in the rhythm of another person's breathing. "You don't have to get up," he whispered, noticing her open eyes. "It's early yet. I'm your partner now," she replied, already reaching for her dress. "Show me what needs doing." In the kitchen, she discovered an old recipe book while starting the coffee. Its pages were stained with use and time, the handwriting varying between two distinct styles, his mother's and grandmother's, Thomas explained. She tucked that knowledge away, another piece of the family history she'd married into. The morning air held autumn's first hint as they walked to the barn together. Thomas showed her how to milk the two remaining cows, his hands covering hers, briefly to demonstrate the proper motion. Sarah's first attempts were clumsy, earning her a disapproving look from the older cow, but she persisted until she found the rhythm. "You're a quick study," Thomas observed, hiding a smile as she wiped milk from her cheek. "Had to be, growing up on a small farm in Ireland, though we had goats, not cows." She patted the cow's flank. "But the principle's the same. Patience and respect for the animal." They moved through the morning chores together, Thomas teaching and Sarah absorbing. He showed her how to check the chicken feed for mold, how to tell when eggs were fresh, how to approach the horses without startling them. Each lesson came with a story. His mother's tricks for keeping rats from the feed, his father's method for breaking gentle horses. "Your family," Sarah ventured during a brief rest. "They built something beautiful here." Thomas leaned against the fence, looking out over the drought-stressed pasture. "They did. Wish you could have seen it in better days. The grass used to grow belly-high on the horses in that south meadow. It will again, Sarah said with quiet certainty. Land remembers what it can be. He glanced at her sharply, hearing an echo of his mother's wisdom in her words. By mid-morning, Sarah had gathered her first eggs without breaking any, helped feed the livestock, and learned the names of their nearest neighbors. Though the nearest was 3 miles away, her skirts were dusty, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but her eyes were bright with purpose. In the kitchen, she found herself humming as she prepared a late breakfast. The recipe book had yielded up a simple biscuit recipe, and soon the house filled with the scent of baking. Thomas came in from fixing a fence to find hot coffee, fresh biscuits, and his account books neatly stacked. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, gesturing to the books. "I started looking them over. Your mother had a good system. I recognized it from the way she noted recipes. Everything categorized, cross-referenced." Thomas sat heavily, accepting the coffee she offered. She taught school before marrying father, brought that organizing mind to everything she did. He paused. "You really think you can help with the books?" "I kept accounts for my father's parish," Sarah replied, sitting across from him. "And I've been studying your mother's notations. She was clever, see here." She opened one ledger, pointing to a series of small marks. "She used symbols to track which cattle came from which bloodlines. Makes it easier to see which breeds do better in drought years." Thomas stared at the marks he'd always assumed were just his mother's quirks. "I never knew that's what those meant. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes," Sarah said softly. "And speaking of cattle, I noticed the north. Pasture still has green grass near the creek bend. Why aren't the herd grazing there?" "Wolves," Thomas explained. "Lost 2 calves there last spring. Haven't had the hands to guard the herd that far out." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "But if we had a way to protect them, that grass could get us through until the rains come." "We?" Thomas asked, something warming in his chest at the word. "We," Sarah confirmed firmly. "Partners, remember? Now tell me more about these wolves. In Ireland, we had ways of protecting sheep. Perhaps some of those methods could work here." As they talked through possibilities, the morning sun climbed higher, warming the kitchen and the fresh-baked biscuits between them. Outside, a meadowlark called, its song carrying across the ranch that was slowly, steadily becoming home to them both. A week of scorching days had turned the morning ritual of checking the almanac into a somber affair. Sarah stood at the kitchen window consulting the worn book's pages while Thomas sipped his coffee. The leather-bound volume, passed down through generations of Barretts, held decades of weather patterns, crop cycles, and handwritten observations. "Your father noted a similar drought in '89, she said, running her finger down a page of faded ink. 3 months without rain, then a deluge that nearly washed away the south fence. Thomas set down his cup. "I remember that year. I was 12. Father lost 20 head of cattle before the rains came." He joined her at the window, looking out at the dusty yard, where Catherine's roses drooped in the heat. "But this feels different, worse." Sarah nodded, turning to the current year's predictions. The spidery writing showed a pattern that made her stomach tighten, each month marked with less and less rainfall. "The Millers stopped by yesterday while you were mending the east fence. They're selling half their herd. Can't blame them. Feed's too expensive to ship in, and what grass is left won't last the month." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "We should think about doing the same." "Not yet," Sarah said firmly, closing the almanac. "I've been studying your mother's books. The Barrett Ranch survived the drought of '89 because your father had alternative income. He let homesteaders graze their sheep on the north pasture for a fee." Thomas straightened. "Sheep? Father never mentioned—" "It's here in the ledger." Sarah retrieved the book from its shelf, opening to a carefully marked page. "See, grazing rights, North Quarter, April through September. The income helped them purchase feed for their own reduced herd until the rains returned." A memory stirred in Thomas's mind. Strange voices at the dinner table, his father discussing boundary lines over coffee. his mother counting unfamiliar coins by lamplight. "I was too young to understand then," he said slowly. "But you're right, we did survive." Before Sarah could respond, a distant rumble drew their attention. They rushed to the porch, hope rising at the sound, but the clouds on the horizon were wrong. Instead of the dark promise of rain, they carried the red-brown tint of a dust storm. "How long?" Sarah asked, already moving with purpose. "Hour, maybe less. Wind's picking up." Thomas was already heading for the barn. "I'll get the horses in. Can you close the shutters, wet the sheets for the windows, check the root cellar?" Sarah was tying on her apron. "I remember dust storms from Ireland, different colour, same devil." They worked with urgent efficiency, Thomas bringing in the livestock while Sarah secured the house. When the first winds hit, they were safely inside, damp sheets hanging over the windows. The storm raged outside, turning day to dusk, then near night. In the dim light of the kitchen, they sat close together, listening to the wind's howl. Sarah had insisted on keeping the stove lit, saying they'd want hot coffee when the worst passed. The familiar scent of brewing coffee fought against the dust that seeped through every crack. "We'll lose more grass to this," Thomas said quietly. "Even if rain comes now, the dust will choke what's left." Sarah reached for his hand in the darkness, a gesture that had become natural over the past week. "Then we'll find another way. The ranch has survived worse." "Has it?" His voice was rough with more than dust. "The bank's deadline is coming. Without rain, without grass, without more cattle to sell." He broke off as Sarah squeezed his hand. "Thomas Barrett, look at me." In the faint light from the stove, her eyes were fierce. "Your father built this ranch from nothing. Your mother made it a home. They faced droughts and dust storms and worse, but they didn't give up, and neither will we." She stood, still holding his hand, and moved to the shelf where she kept the ranch records. By the light of a single lamp, she spread out the ledgers, the almanac, and a sheet of her own careful notes. "The North Pasture Plan could work again, and I've been thinking, the old chicken coop, with some repair, we could raise enough hens to sell eggs in town. The general store owner already asked if we had any to spare." As the storm raged outside, they bent their heads together over the books, two people united against nature's fury and financial pressure, finding strength in shared determination. When Thomas looked at his wife's profile in the lamplight, he saw not the stranger he'd married a week ago, but a partner as stubborn and resilient as the land itself. The day after the dust storm, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a freshly opened journal before her. Her father had taught her the importance of keeping detailed records, and now those lessons were bearing fruit. Each page contained carefully calculated figures, egg production estimates, feed costs, potential markets in town. Thomas entered, stamping dust from his boots. "Storm damaged the south fence worse than I thought. Spent all morning rounding up strays." He paused, noting her intense concentration. "What's all this?" "Our future," Sarah replied, not looking up from her calculations. "I've been thinking about what your mother wrote about diversifying the ranch's income. The chicken coop repairs would cost less than feeding one cow through winter, and eggs sell for a premium now that the miller's hens have stopped laying." Thomas poured himself coffee, frowning. "Eggs? Sarah, this is a cattle ranch. It's a ranch that's about to fail if we don't try something new." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw him stiffen. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. But Thomas, look at these numbers." She pushed the journal toward him, pages filled with her neat script. "The general store owner, Mr. Peterson, says he can't keep eggs in stock. Town's growing, despite the drought. And his wife mentioned they're bringing in canned vegetables all the way from Denver because local gardens are failing. What does that have to do with us?" "The root cellar." Sarah stood, warming to her subject. "Your mother's journal mentions it stays cool even in August. With proper shelving, we could grow and store vegetables through summer, sell them in fall when prices are highest." Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "My father built this spread for cattle ranching. It's what we know, what we've always done. And how's that working now? The words hung between them sharp as broken glass. A muscle ticked in Thomas's jaw. I need to check the north pasture. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Sarah, I know you're trying to help, but some things here, they're built on more than just numbers in a book. The door closed behind him with careful quietness, somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. Sarah sank back into her chair, frustration warring with understanding. She knew about pride, about holding on to what was known and trusted. Hadn't her own father held on to his tiny parish long after the famine had driven most of his congregation? To America or the grave? Her eyes fell on Catherine Barrett's recipe book, still open on the counter. Something caught her attention. A note in the margin beside a pickle recipe. Good price at harvest fair. Better than beef this year. Intrigued, Sarah began flipping through the book with new purpose. More notes emerged. Calculations for preserve quantities, lists of vegetables that stored well, records of prices received at various markets. This wasn't just a recipe book, it was a business ledger in disguise. When Thomas returned hours later, the sun settling into dusk, he found Sarah still at the kitchen table. But now, Catherine's recipe book sat beside her journal, and the table was covered with papers showing two different hands, his mother's and his wife's. Your mother, Sarah said quietly, not looking up. She did more than keep house, didn't she? These preserves, the extra eggs, the vegetables. She sold them all through the last drought, kept the ranch afloat, while your father focused on rebuilding the herd. Thomas stood very still in the doorway. Finally, he said, I remember her at the harvest fair every year. Father always said she drove a harder bargain than any cattle dealer. She knew, didn't she, that a ranch needs more than one way to survive. Sarah finally met his eyes. I'm not trying to change what the Barrett Ranch is, Thomas. I'm trying to help it survive, like she did. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of past and present, pride and necessity. Then Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Show me, he said softly. Show me what you figured out. Sarah pushed her journal toward him, then reached for Catherine's recipe book. We'll start with the chicken coop. Your mother left detailed notes about the best breeds for both eggs and meat. And look here, she pointed to a faded diagram. She designed a way to protect them from foxes using nothing but scrapwood and wire. As the evening deepened around them, they bent together over the books, their earlier tension dissolving into shared purpose. Outside, a cool breeze stirred. The dust-covered roses, carrying the first hint of change. The wagon rattled into Silver Creek early Thursday morning, loaded with their first harvest, 3 dozen fresh eggs, late summer vegetables from the restored kitchen garden, and preserves Sarah had made from Catherine's recipes. Thomas handled the reins while Sarah sat straight beside him, her mother's Bible in her lap, not for reading but for the comfort of its familiar weight. You're sure about this? Thomas asked, noting how she gripped the Bible tighter as they approached the general store. The numbers don't lie, she replied, though her voice held a tremor. This was more than their first market day. It was her first return to town since that night in the barn. Mr. Peterson promised fair prices for fresh eggs. They pulled up to the store's loading dock, and Thomas helped her down, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow. The early morning air held autumn's first crispness, and the street was already busy with ranchers' wives doing their shopping while the day was cool. Inside, Mr. Peterson's face lit up at the sight of their goods. Mrs. Barrett, those preserves, looked just like Catherine's. He examined a jar of pickled beans. Same careful packing, same clear brine. And eggs, thank heavens. We've been desperate for fresh eggs. As they discussed prices, Sarah felt herself relaxing. Her calculations had been right. The eggs would fetch twice what she'd estimated. Mr. Peterson even offered to take all their future production, mentioning something about a new mining camp opening up in the hills. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah's world tilted. A woman's voice, cultured and cold. Well, if it isn't the mail-order bride who couldn't wait. Thomas turned first, his shoulder moving instinctively to shield Sarah. Margaret Henderson stood in the doorway, her fine dress making Sarah's simple cotton one seem suddenly shabby. Behind her loomed her husband Henry, his face flushed with either embarrassment or the early hour. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mr. Henderson, I trust Oregon agrees with you?" Margaret's eyes narrowed at Sarah's composure. "More than some foreign girl with no references would have agreed with us. Really, running off with the first man you met? That's enough!" Thomas's voice cut through the store like a blade. "You're speaking about my wife, Mrs. Henderson, the woman who's helped save our ranch while you abandoned yours to foreclosure." Henry Henderson stepped forward, his face darkening. "Now see here, Barrett. No, you see here." Thomas's quiet tone carried more weight than any shout. "You left this woman stranded without so much as a note. She could have died that night, alone in a strange country. Instead, God led her to my barn, and I thank him every day for it." Sarah slipped her hand into Thomas's, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm sorry your plans changed, Mrs. Henderson, but mine changed for the better." Mr. Peterson, who had been watching with poorly concealed interest, chose that moment to speak up. "Speaking of better, Mrs. Barrett, these preserves are a blessing, just like your mother-in-law's used to be, Thomas. She always knew what the town needed before we did ourselves." The simple praise, delivered with perfect timing, seemed to deflate Margaret Henderson's righteous indignation. She looked around the store, taking in the respect in Mr. Peterson's voice, the quiet confidence in Sarah's stance, the protective way Thomas stood beside his wife. "Well," she said finally, her voice less certain, "I suppose everything worked out for the best." She turned to leave, then paused. Those preserves, are they really like Catherine Barrett's?" "Her exact recipe," Sarah replied softly. "Would you like a jar?" Something shifted in Margaret's face. A recognition, perhaps, of what she'd lost in her hasty judgment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would." After the Hendersons left, jar of preserves in hand, Sarah leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and she felt the tension in his body matching her own. "You did well," he murmured. "Better than they deserved." Mr. Peterson, arranging their eggs in his cooler, called over his shoulder, "Your Catherine would be proud, Thomas. She always said the measure of a person shows in how they handle those who've wronged them." He straightened up, beaming at Sarah. "You'll do fine here, Mrs. Barrett. Just fine indeed." On the wagon ride home, their profits, carefully counted and stored in Sarah's Bible, Thomas finally asked, "Would you have been happier with them?" In Oregon, Sarah looked at the land rolling past, drought-stressed but still beautiful, still fighting to survive. Like them. "No," she said simply. "I was meant to find that barn, meant to find you." Thomas nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. Above them, a pair of hawks circled in the morning thermals, riding the air currents together, partners in the endless dance of survival. August arrived like a furnace blast, scorching what little remained of the spring's promise. Sarah stood in her newly planted garden at dawn, studying the wilted leaves of her careful plantings. The dried flowers from her first attempts lay pressed in Catherine's recipe book, reminders of hope in the face of nature's fury. The wells. "Holding," Thomas said behind her, anticipating her daily question. "But we'll need to be careful. Miller's lost theirs yesterday." Sarah nodded, touching a tomato plant's yellowing leaves. She'd rigged a system of canvas sheets to shade the vegetables during the worst heat, an old Irish trick her grandmother had used. "The morning dew helps," she said. "If we can keep them alive until September." Their new routine had evolved. Over the past weeks, up before dawn, to water the gardens with carefully measured amounts, checking the chickens, now nearly 30 strong, in their reinforced coop. Thomas tending the reduced herd, while Sarah managed their growing egg business and worked on Catherine's preserved vegetable recipes. "Mr. Peterson sent word," Sarah continued, straightening her back. "The mining camp's expanding. They're asking For more eggs, more preserves, whatever we can provide. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, now streaked with more grey than when they'd met. That's good news, but he broke off, looking toward the cattle in the distance. Even from here, they could see ribs showing through drought-thin hides. We'll lose more before it's over, Sarah said gently, naming the fear he wouldn't voice. But we won't lose everything, not like the Millers. They'd watched their neighbors' slow collapse over the past month. First the well, then the cattle. Sold for pennies on the dollar, and finally the farm itself, shuttered and silent. Each loss had strengthened Sarah's resolve to diversify their income and Thomas's willingness to try new approaches. Inside the kitchen, the day's first batch of eggs waited in their basket. Sarah had learned to grade them carefully, the largest and most perfect for the mining camp, the others for the general store. Even the smallest found use in her baking, which she'd begun selling at Mr. Peterson's alongside the preserves. Found something yesterday, Thomas said, helping her sort the eggs. In Father's old trunk. He pulled out a leather folder, its surface cracked with age. Deed to the North water rights. Never knew he'd bought them. Sarah paused in her work, understanding the document's significance. The creek that feeds the North pasture belongs to us all the way to the bend. Miller's selling his water rights with the farm, but ours are separate. If we could repair the old irrigation channels, we could water more than just gardens, Sarah finished, excitement building. But the cost! Thomas spread the deed on the table, next to Sarah's account book. Show me the numbers again, for the eggs and preserves. She opened the book, revealing neat columns of figures. Their modest beginnings had grown steadily, each week showing better returns than the last. Mr. Peterson had even begun taking orders in advance, particularly for Catherine's pickle recipe. If we keep at this pace through autumn, Sarah's finger traced down the column, it might be enough, not all at once, but bit by bit. Thomas studied the figures, then looked out the window at the struggling ranch. The contrast between the veiling pastures and Sarah's carefully tended gardens struck him suddenly. One holding on through sheer determination and innovative care, the other withering under old methods. Catherine used to say, he spoke slowly, that sometimes you have to let something die back to let it grow stronger. Maybe this drought is showing us a new way forward. Sarah reached across the table, taking his work-roughened hand in hers. The gold of his mother's ring caught the morning light. Not new, she corrected softly. Your parents knew it too. That's why they bought those water rights. Why your mother kept such careful records of her preserves. They understood about having more than one way to survive. Together they looked out at the land, their land now in all its struggling glory. The garden's canvas shades flapped in the hot wind, protecting tender plants beneath. Chickens scratched. In their reinforced yard, safe from predators. And in the distance the North Creek glinted like a promise. We'll make it work, Sarah said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had brought her across an ocean on a promise. Not just survive, thrive. Thomas squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her slender fingers. Yes, he agreed, we will. And for the first time since the drought began, he truly believed it. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the Barrett ranch, casting long shadows across the yard where Sarah and Thomas worked in comfortable silence. Their first profit ledger lay open on the porch steps, its pages filled with more black ink than red. Inside, the kitchen shelves boasted rows of preserved vegetables, their glass jars gleaming in the lamplight. Last batch, Thomas announced, setting down a crate of late tomatoes. The vines had finally surrendered to autumn's chill, but not before yielding a surprising bounty, protected through summer by Sarah's careful tending. These will fetch a good price, Sarah said, examining a particularly fine specimen. The mining camp's cook sent word they're especially keen on my tomato preserves. She didn't add that they were Catherine's recipe. That went without saying now. Thomas watched her work, noting how confidently she moved through what had been his mother's kitchen, Sarah had made it her own these past months, yet somehow kept Catherine's spirit alive in every jar she filled, every loaf she baked. The thought stirred something warm in his chest. "We should go to the harvest fair," he said suddenly, "like Mother used to. Your preserves would win ribbons." Sarah looked up, surprised. They hadn't attended any social functions since their marriage, both too focused on survival to think of celebration. "Are you sure? The North Pasture irrigation can wait a day." Thomas stepped closer, taking the tomato from her hands and setting it carefully in its crate. "We've earned a bit of pride, don't you think?" The next morning found them loading the wagon before dawn. Sarah had spent half the night selecting her best preserves, arranging them in Catherine's old display basket. Thomas had polished the wagon until it shone, and even put on his good shirt, the one Sarah had mended so carefully after finding it in the back of their wardrobe. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity despite the lingering effects of the drought. Other ranchers had come too, drawn by the promise of community and the chance to forget their troubles for a day. Sarah felt Thomas's hand at the small of her back as they navigated the crowds, a gesture that had become natural somewhere along the way. "Catherine Barrett's girl," Mrs. Peterson called from her booth. "Brought your preserves, I hope." The judge was just asking after them. Sarah felt her cheeks warm at being called Catherine's girl, but Thomas's proud smile made her stand straighter. "Right here," she said, lifting the display basket. "Though I doubt they'll compare to Mrs. Miller's. Millers aren't here this year," Mrs. Peterson said softly. "Farms all locked up. Such a shame." She brightened. "But we've heard about what you two are doing out there. Eggs, vegetables, preserves. Just like Catherine always said, diversifying is the key." Throughout the morning, more people stopped to talk, each conversation a subtle shift in how the community saw them. No longer the mail-order bride and the struggling rancher, but the Barretts who were making it work despite everything. The preserves won 3 ribbons, first place for the pickled beans, second for the tomatoes, and a special mention for Catherine's famous chow chow relish. But it was the conversation Sarah overheard that meant the most. "Just like his mother," an old rancher was saying to his wife, "found himself a partner, not just a wife." Catherine would be proud. When Thomas found her later by the cotton candy stand, Sarah's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Ready to head home?" he asked, noting her expression. "In a minute." She was looking at the couples dancing to a fiddle's cheerful tune. "I was just thinking, we never had a proper wedding dance." Thomas followed her gaze, then held out his hand. "Mrs. Barrett," he said formally, though his eyes crinkled at the corners, "would you do me the honor?" They moved together, as if they'd been dancing for years, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. The fiddle played something slow and sweet, and around them the fair's lights blurred into a warm glow. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, "for the dance, for finding me in that barn, for taking a chance on a stranger." Thomas pulled back just enough to look at her face, seeing not the frightened woman he'd discovered that dawn, but the partner who had helped him save his family's legacy, who had become family herself, somewhere between the dust storms and the harvest moon. "Sarah," he said softly, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. But she understood, as she always did now. Standing on tiptoe, she kissed him, there. First real kiss, tasting of cotton candy and possibility. Around them, the harvest fair continued its cheerful bustle, but they danced on, lost in the moonlight and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest crops grow from the hardest seasons. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the Barrett ranch in pristine white. Sarah stood at their bedroom window, watching Thomas break ice in the cattle troughs, a ritual that would become familiar in the months ahead. On their bed lay her latest project, a quilt she'd been piecing together, from scraps of fabric, each square holding its own story. There was the faded blue cotton from her first dress in America, the sturdy denim from Thomas's old work shirt, and best of all, the preserved pieces of Catherine's aprons that they'd found in the attic. Sarah's fingers had worked late into the nights, stitching their growing love story into something tangible and warm. "Storm's coming," Thomas announced, stamping snow from his boots as he entered their room. Johnson's boy rode by with the warning. "Could be 3 days of it." Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloguing their preparations. The root cellar was full, the chicken coop reinforced, and enough firewood stacked by the hearth to last a week. Yet something in Thomas's tone made her turn from the window. "What is it?" He smiled slightly, still amazed at how well she read him now. "Found tracks by the north fence. Wolf prints, bigger than usual. They're moving down from the high country. Early this year." Sarah's hand stilled on the quilt. They'd lost no cattle to wolves since her arrival, thanks to their vigilance and her suggestion of Irish bell collars for the herd. But winter wolves were different. Desperate, bold. "We'll bring the pregnant heifers closer to the house," she said, "and I'll help you check the fences tomorrow before the storm hits." Thomas crossed to her, his cold hands finding her warm ones. "Already done. Couldn't sleep last night, so I rode out at first light." He paused, looking down at the quilt. "Is that Mother's Sunday apron?" The pocket was still good. Sarah said softly, "See? I've put it here, right in the center, the heart of the pattern." His throat worked as he traced the familiar flowered print. Then he noticed the neat stitching around the edges, their names, worked in careful threads with the date they'd married. "It's beautiful," he managed. "Like everything you do." The compliment hung in the air between them, more intimate than any they'd shared before. Since the harvest fair, something had shifted in their relationship, like ice breaking up on a spring river. The careful distance they'd maintained had gradually melted away, replaced by lingering touches, shared glances. And now this, moments of raw honesty that left them both vulnerable and stronger. The storm arrived that evening, howling around. The eaves like a living thing. They sat close together by the fire, the new quilt across their laps, while Sarah read aloud from her father's old book of Irish tales. The stories of ancient heroes and clever peasant girls filled the room, her voice painting pictures that pushed back the winter dark. "My mother used to tell that one," Thomas said, when she finished a tale about a poor farmer who outsmarted a fairy king. Though in her version, the farmer had red hair and an Irish accent. Sarah laughed, the sound warming him more than the fire. "Did she tell you many stories?" "Every winter night. Said stories were like quilts for the soul, pieced together from old memories and new dreams, keeping us warm through hard times." Outside, the wind rose to a crescendo, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, the rancher in him always alert to threats to his herd. Without thinking, she reached up to smooth the worry from his brow. The touch lingered, her fingers tracing the lines that life had carved around his eyes. Thomas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth cascading through her entire body. "I never expected this," he whispered against her skin. "When I found you in that barn—" "Nor I," Sarah admitted. "I thought I was settling. For security, for a chance to survive. Instead..." She turned to face him fully, moonlight and firelight painting shadows across their faces. "Instead, I found home, found love." The word they'd both been dancing around finally spoken, Thomas pulled her close. The quilt slipped forgotten to the floor as they kissed, no longer tentative like at the harvest fair, but deep and certain. When they finally parted, Sarah rested her forehead against his. "The wolves can howl," she murmured. "The storm can rage. We've built something stronger than winter here." Thomas gathered her closer, understanding completely. They'd forged their love like a well-tempered blade, through heat and pressure, hammered by hardship into something unbreakable. Outside, the storm could do its worst. Inside, they had all the warmth they needed. Spring arrived at the Barrett Ranch with the subtlety of a Sunday sermon. Quiet at first, then building to a crescendo of life and color. Sarah stood in the doorway of their newly expanded chicken coop, a seed catalogue clutched in her hands, watching Thomas repair the winter-damaged garden fence. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and her heart swelled with a familiar warmth. "The Peterson order is our largest yet," she called to him, consulting her notes. "They're asking if we can double our egg production by summer." Thomas straightened, driving the last post into the softening earth. "Good timing. That last batch of chicks is nearly ready to lay." He walked over, wiping his hands on his pants. "How are the new irrigation channels holding?" "The north pasture's already showing green. Your father knew what he was doing when he bought those water rights." She opened the catalogue, pointing to a carefully marked page. "Look what I found. Heritage vegetable seeds, the same varieties your mother used to grow. Mr. Peterson says there's demand for specialty produce from the mining camps now. They're willing to pay premium prices." Thomas studied the page, his arm settling naturally around her waist. The easy intimacy of the gesture still thrilled her, even after their winter of growing closer. "Mother would have loved this," he said, seeing the garden coming back to life. They walked together through the ranch that had transformed under their joint care. The winter storms had left the land moisture-rich, promising a season of growth. Already, the differences were visible. New fencing gleamed in the morning light. The chicken coop had doubled in size, and the repaired irrigation channels traced life-giving veins through the north pasture. Near the house, Catherine's roses were budding, tiny hints of pink promising summer blooms. Sarah had pruned them carefully during the winter, using techniques she'd learned from an old gardening book found in the attic. Like everything else, on the ranch, they just needed proper tending to thrive. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, stopping by the garden plot, "about expansion." Sarah's heart quickened. They discussed possibilities during the long winter nights, dreaming together under her quilted masterpiece, the West Field. He nodded. "With the irrigation working so well in the north pasture, we could do the same there. Run channels from the creek, create a proper market garden." His eyes took on the distant look she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was seeing future possibilities. Maybe even build a proper greenhouse, like the one Mother always wanted. "A greenhouse would let us grow through winter," Sarah mused, already calculating figures in her head. And with the banknote nearly paid off, they'd made the final payment just last week, the result of their combined efforts. Sarah's eggs and preserves, Thomas's careful management of the reduced but healthier herd, and their shared determination to honor the legacy they'd inherited while building something new. "There's something else," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Found this in town yesterday." Sarah unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a small book. "Modern Methods of Market Gardening." Her vision blurred slightly as she read the inscription he'd written inside. "To my partner in all things. Love, Thomas." "I thought," he said softly, "since we're expanding the garden, you might want to add some new techniques to Catherine's. Old ones, create something that's uniquely ours." Sarah traced the book's cover, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. They'd moved beyond merely preserving what came before. Now they were building their own legacy, combining old wisdom with new ideas. "I have something for you, too," she said. Leading him into the house, she retrieved a document from her desk drawer, the results of her winter evening work. "I've been recording everything we've learned, all the successful methods, the timing of plantings, the best preservation techniques. So someday," she hesitated, then forged ahead, "someday our children will have a guide, like Catherine left for us." Thomas took the notebook, his hands gentle on its pages filled with Sarah's careful script and Catherine's preserved wisdom. When he looked at her, his eyes held the same love she'd seen that winter night by the fire, but now mixed with something more, a shared vision of the future they were creating. "Our children," he repeated softly, pulling her close. "Tell me more about these plans of yours, Mrs. Barrett." Sarah smiled against his chest, breathing in the scent of spring earth and new possibilities. Outside, the land was awakening, ready for another season of growth. Inside, their love had bloomed into something as sturdy as the roses by the porch, deep-rooted, flowering, and ever growing toward the light. The letter arrived on a warm spring afternoon, delivered by young Billy Peterson, who'd ridden out specially from his father's store. "Pa said it's from Ireland," he announced importantly, handing the envelope to Sarah. "Came by ship, then train, then rider." Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized her sister Mary's precise handwriting. She'd written to Mary months ago, finally feeling settled enough to share news of her marriage and life at the Barrett Ranch. Now, sitting in Catherine's kitchen, her kitchen, she broke the seal and began to read. Thomas found her there an hour later. The letter spread on the table before her, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Without a word, he pulled up a chair beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but giving her space to speak when ready. "Mary's husband died," Sarah finally said, her voice rough. "Fever took him in February. She's alone with 2 small children, trying to manage what's left of Father's parish house." She touched the letter's pages, where the ink was blotted in places. "The new priest, he's not kind, wants the house for his own family." Thomas covered her hand with his. "What does she need?" The simple question, not what can we do or how terrible, but a direct path to action, was so characteristic of him that Sarah felt fresh tears well up. "She's proud, like me. Doesn't ask directly, but reading between the lines." "She needs to come here," Thomas finished. Not a question this time, but a statement of fact. Sarah turned to him, searching his face. "Thomas, I couldn't ask." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He smiled slightly. "The ranch is doing well now. The Westfield expansion is underway. We could use another pair of hands. And those children—" He paused, then continued softly. "This house was built for a family. It's been too quiet for too long." "But the expense," Sarah protested, even as hope bloomed in her chest. "Passage for 3. Thomas stood and went to his desk, returning with their account books. "Show me the numbers. That's what partners do, right? Face challenges together." They spent the evening with the books, heads bent close together. Sarah's careful accounting showed their steady progress. Eggs and preserves bringing in reliable income, the reduced but healthier herd prospering, advance orders for summer produce already paid. Thomas had been right. They could manage it. "We'll need to add on to the house eventually," Thomas mused, sketching rough plans on a spare piece of paper. "The children can share the small room for now. Mary can take the guest room, and later," he glanced at Sarah, "later, we might need more space ourselves." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, understanding his meaning. They'd been talking more openly, about children of their own, especially during the intimate winter evenings. The thought of their future children growing up with Mary's, cousins playing together like she and Mary once had. "I've been selfish," she said suddenly, "keeping all this to myself, this home, this life we've built." "Stop!" Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "You earned this life. We built it together. And now," he gestured to the prosperous ranch. Visible through the window, the new gardens, the expanded coops. "Now we have enough to share." "That's not selfish, Sarah. That's providence." Sarah stood and walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the land in shades of gold. Somewhere across the ocean, her sister was probably putting her children to bed, wondering about their future. "She's skilled with herbs," she said softly. "Has mother's knowledge of medicinal plants. And she can teach. She helped father with the parish school." Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Sounds like she takes after her sister. Good with numbers, are they, these Irish girls?" Sarah laughed despite her tears, leaning back against him. "We manage." She turned in his embrace, facing him fully. "Are you certain about this? Taking on 3 more people? Family isn't a burden, love. It's a blessing." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "Your sister, her children, they're part of you. That makes them part of us." Sarah reached up and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and love into the gesture. When they parted, she went straight to her desk and pulled out fresh paper. "I'll write back tonight. Tell her to sell whatever she can. Use the money for passage. We'll handle the rest." As she wrote, Thomas lit the lamps and stoked the fire, moving around their home with quiet purpose. Outside, the spring evening settled over the ranch, where Catherine's roses were budding, and new life stirred in the freshly planted fields. Soon, other voices would fill these rooms. Other feet would walk these floors. The thought felt right, like the closing of a circle. The mail-order bride, who had found love in a barn, now offering sanctuary to others, turning a house built for family back into a home. The station platform at Silver Creek looked different in summer sunshine than it had that fateful evening a year ago. Sarah stood beside Thomas, shading her eyes against the bright Montana sky, watching for the train that would bring her sister and nieces into their expanding world. "Train's running on time," Thomas said, checking his father's pocket watch. "Should be here any minute." Sarah smoothed her best dress, the one she'd sewn from fabric Thomas had surprised her with after their last successful market day. So much had changed since her own arrival. The frightened woman who'd slept in a barn was now a respected rancher's wife, waiting to welcome her own family to a prosperous home. The train's whistle split the air, and Sarah's heart leaped. Thomas squeezed her hand as the locomotive rounded the bend, steam billowing white against the blue sky. "Ready?" he asked softly. Before she could answer, the train was slowing, brakes squealing against iron rails. And there, a pale face at a window, followed by two smaller ones. Mary. Time seemed to blur. Later, Sarah would remember fragments. Mary's cry of recognition, the children's wide-eyed stares, Thomas quietly handling the luggage while the sisters clung to each other. Little Catherine, named for their mother, was 6 now, Michael just 4, both of them sun-browned from the long journey. "Sarah," Mary breathed, pulling back to look at her sister. You're glowing." Sarah felt herself blush, one hand straying unconsciously to her midsection, where their joyful secret was just beginning to show. They'd planned to share the news once the family was settled, but Mary had always been able to read her like a book. The ride home was filled with chatter, the children's Irish accents thick as cream as they marveled at everything. The vast sky, the distant mountains, the cattle dotting the pastures. Thomas handled the wagon with careful smoothness, adding quiet comments that soon had young Michael fascinated with the horses. When they crested the last hill, Sarah felt a surge of pride at Mary's gasp. The Barrett Ranch spread before them, transformed from the struggling homestead of a year ago. New fencing gleamed in the summer light. The expanded chicken coops bustled with activity, and the market garden was a patchwork of green against the golden prairie. "You did all this?" Mary whispered. "We did," Sarah replied, catching Thomas's smile. Together, the house welcomed them with the scent of fresh bread and the sight of Catherine's roses climbing wild and beautiful around the porch. Sarah had prepared their mother's Irish stew, the recipe she'd discovered tucked in the family Bible, and set it to simmer that morning. "Your room's upstairs," she told Mary, leading them inside. "The children's just next to it. We've put up new curtains." And Thomas built them each a bed. She trailed off, seeing tears in Mary's eyes as she took in the peaceful prosperity of the home. "When your letter came," Mary said softly, "I hardly dared hope. After James died," she straightened her shoulders, "but I won't bring sadness to this day. Look at this place, Sarah. Look what you've built." "What we've built," Thomas corrected gently, entering with the last of the luggage. "And we'll keep building. Mary, Sarah tells me you know about medicinal herbs?" Mary nodded, surprised by the question. "Good. We've set aside part of the greenhouse for just that. The mining camps need more than eggs and vegetables, if you're willing to help." "A greenhouse?" Mary's eyes widened. "Like the one at Henderson Hall?" "Bigger," Sarah smiled. "Come see." They spent the afternoon showing Mary and the children their new home. The greenhouse sparkled with promise, its newly fitted glass catching the summer light. The chicken coops rang with comfortable clucking, and the garden beds stretched neat and abundant. Even the cattle looked prosperous, grazing in the irrigated north pasture. Little Catherine fell in love with a newly hatched clutch of chicks, while Michael trailed after Thomas, asking endless questions about horses. Mary's practiced eye noted the herbs already growing in the greenhouse's medicinal section, and soon she and Sarah were deep in discussion about expanding the selection. That evening, they gathered for dinner around the big kitchen table, the one that had seemed so empty when Sarah first arrived. Now it felt right, filled with family voices, Irish blessings mixing with American dreams. Thomas sat at the head, his quiet pride evident in every glance at the expanded family. After the meal, as twilight painted the sky in purple and gold, they sat on the porch, watching the children chase fireflies in the yard. Mary's hands were busy with mending. She'd insisted on contributing immediately, while Sarah worked on a new quilt, this one sized for a cradle. "I understand now," Mary said softly, "why you wrote that God led you to that barn. This isn't just a marriage, is it? It's a miracle." Sarah looked at Thomas, who was teaching Michael how to whistle through a blade of grass, and felt the gentle quickening of new life within her. "No," she agreed, "it's not just a marriage, it's a future." Above them, the first star appeared in the deepening sky, a single point of light promising guidance, just as it had that night when a frightened girl sought shelter in a stranger's barn. But she wasn't frightened anymore, and the barn wasn't. Strange and love, it seemed, could grow as naturally as roses climbing toward the sun. Dawn painted the old barn in shades of memory, its weathered boards glowing golden in the early light. Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her now visible pregnancy, remembering another morning a year ago when she'd huddled in the hayloft, alone and afraid, thinking deep thoughts. Thomas's voice came soft behind her, and his arms slipped around her waist, cradling both her and their growing child. "Remembering," she replied, leaning back against him. "Did you ever imagine that morning that we'd be here like this?" "I imagined something," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Not this exactly. Something smaller, safer maybe, but you've always had a way of exceeding my imagination, Mrs. Barrett." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them, Mary riding up on the gentle mare Thomas had trained for her, the children secure in the small cart behind. "The Reverend and Mrs. Mills are on their way," she called, "and I saw dust from other wagons on the road." They'd planned this day carefully, this celebration of not just their anniversary, but the life they'd built together. The old barn had been cleaned and decorated, Catherine's roses woven into garlands that hung from the rafters. Sarah had baked enough to feed half the county, and Mary's herb garden had provided flowers for every surface. "Time to get ready," Mary announced, shooing Thomas away. "You're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony, even if she's already your wife." Thomas laughed, but obediently turned toward the house. "I'll check on the preparations," he called over his shoulder. "Try not to fall in love with any other wandering cowboys while I'm gone." "Too late," Sarah called back. "Already found. The one I want." Inside the barn, Mary helped Sarah change into her new dress, cream-colored cotton, simply cut to accommodate her growing shape, but beautifully embroidered with tiny roses along the hem and sleeves. "You did this," Sarah said, touching the delicate stitching. "When did you find the time?" "While you were sleeping," Mary smiled. "Being up with morning sickness gave me plenty of quiet hours to work." She stepped back, evaluating her handiwork. "There. Now you look like what you are. A woman who turned a moment of desperation into a lifetime of joy." The guests arrived. Steadily. The Petersons, neighboring ranchers, friends made over the past year. Each arrival reminded Sarah of how much had changed, how deeply rooted they'd become in this community. Young Catherine and Michael darted between the adults, proudly showing off their barn to anyone who would listen. When Reverend Mills arrived, his wife carrying the same Bible they'd used a year ago, Sarah felt tears threatening. But these were different from the desperate tears she'd shed that first morning. These were tears of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. Thomas waited for her at the front of the barn, where morning light streamed through the hayloft window. He wore his best suit, but Sarah noticed with love that his boots were still dusty from morning chores. Some things shouldn't change, dearly. "Beloved," Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying to the rafters where barn swallows nested peacefully. "We gather today not to join these two in marriage, for God and circumstance did that a year ago in my kitchen at dawn, but to celebrate the love that grew from that practical beginning." Sarah and Thomas had written their own vows for this ceremony, words crafted from a year of shared experiences and deeper understanding. "Thomas," Sarah spoke first, her voice clear and strong, "I came to you a stranger, seeking shelter. You offered partnership when I needed it most, but you gave me so much more, a home, a future, a love I never dared to imagine. I vow to keep building this life with you, to face whatever comes with the same strength and grace you've shown me." Thomas's hands tightened on hers. "Sarah, you found me when I was lost, though I didn't know it. You brought life back to this ranch, back to my heart. I vow to keep loving you with the same courage you showed that first morning, the courage to trust, to grow, to build something beautiful from whatever life gives us." They exchanged rings again. Thomas's mother's ring, now accompanied by a simple gold band Sarah had saved in secret to buy him. As they kissed, sunlight broke fully through the hayloft window, illuminating them in a shaft of gold. The celebration that followed filled the barn with laughter and music. Children played in the sweet hay, adults danced to fiddle tunes, and everyone ate their fill of Sarah's cooking. Mary's herb flower centerpieces graced every table, and even Mr. Peterson's normally reserved wife was seen tapping her feet to the music. As evening approached, Thomas led Sarah outside for a moment of quiet. The setting sun turned the ranch into a painting of purple and gold, while the sound of celebration drifted from the barn. "Happy anniversary, love," he murmured, holding her close. Sarah watched a pair of hawks circling overhead, partners in the endless dance of sky and earth. "Happy beginning," she corrected softly, guiding his hand to where their child moved within her. Together, they stood in the fading light, surrounded by the life they'd built from hope and hard work and love that had grown as naturally as roses climbing toward heaven. On a bright spring morning 5 years later, Sarah Barrett stood in her garden, watching her daughter Catherine Rose, named for both grandmothers, trying to catch butterflies among the vegetables. Inside the house, the sound of Mary teaching arithmetic to the older children mingled with the quiet creaking of the cradle where baby James slept, watched over by his aunt. The Barrett Ranch had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. The greenhouse now stretched twice its original length, Mary's medicinal herbs becoming as famous as Sarah's preserves. The chicken operation had grown into a proper business, supplying eggs to towns across 3 counties, and Thomas's careful stewardship had restored the cattle herd to its former glory, their bloodlines strengthened by smart breeding and better pasture management. But the real treasure was in the small moments. Thomas teaching young Michael to ride, Mary's children growing tall and strong in the Montana air, the family gathering each evening around the table that had once seemed so empty. Catherine's roses still climbed the porch, now accompanied by Irish wildflowers Mary had coaxed from carefully preserved seeds. "Mama!" little Catherine Rose called, running up with fistfuls of fresh peas. "Papa's home!" Sarah turned to see Thomas riding in, his smile as warm as the day she'd first met him. He carried something in his saddlebag, a gift for their anniversary, no doubt. 5 years of marriage had only deepened their love, each challenge faced, together making them stronger. As she walked to meet him, Sarah sent a quiet prayer of thanks heavenward. That desperate night in the barn hadn't been an ending after all. It had been a beginning, the first light of a dawn that kept breaking, beautiful and new with each passing day.